Okay, I think we're live. We're just going to check here for a second. Well, maybe not. Okay, so good afternoon. We'll give it about a minute for people to sign on. And I don't know why I'm so dark. I have a light right on me, but I guess the shadows are killing me today. But we'll figure it out. But anyway, it is October 5th. It is 4 o'clock. This is Steve Mazzacane of the Steve Mazzacane Podcast. Thank you for joining us. We'll have Sean Sanlon on in a second. But we hope everybody had a great weekend and are getting outside today. Since we signed off last Thursday, we've had a ton of headlines dealing with the national issues, special session in Hartford, Trump getting sick, being in the hospital. We just saw a press conference that he is returning home this afternoon to the White House. So we're going to have a ton of opinions on that. We'll have Sean Scanlon on in a second. You can post questions or comments if you'd like. And as we talk, if I see something that is relevant, I'll make sure I ask him and we can go through that. So let me pull Sean in here. All right, Sean, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
We are live. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. You are the second guest in our history. Now we had you were on in person when we had the studio.
Yeah.
So this is the first one. We had the animal shelter, Laura Bourbon on Thursday. And so you're the second one. So listen, like in 15 years, when I have a multi-million-dollar contract on like some radio station, there's going to be a Jeopardy question. Who was the second guest ever on Steve Mazzacane's podcast? And you will be the answer to that question. You may be president. You may be president by then. So we may have a history. But thanks for joining us. And yeah, as we talked earlier, I just want to, if you can start with giving us a rundown of what happened last week on your level on the special session. What are some of the bills that passed? What was the urgency of the special session sort of thing? Go for it.
Well, probably the biggest one that is relevant to most people, there was 10 bills. A lot of them were very small bills that were bipartisan. Every one of the bills that we did was bipartisan last week. But the biggest one, of course, was about Eversource. And, you know, Steve, you and I met on the side of the road one day during that Isaias storm, talking about how unhappy I was and how unhappy, frankly, everybody was with the performance of Eversource during that storm. And then a few weeks later, when we had that freak tornado type storm in Branford that knocked out, I think, 95% of the town. In both cases, Eversource was really, really slow to respond. And it's something that I think is happening more and more often. And during Isaias and during that freak tornado storm, I heard over and over again from people, they were like, Sean, don't let this be another time when you and every other politician says, hey, we're going to do something about this, and then nothing ever happens. And so the bill that we debated last week and passed, again, on an overwhelming bipartisan basis, did two really, really important things. The first one is to fundamentally change the way that they're regulated and the way that they get rate increases. Right now, they go to this thing called PURA, which is the Public Utilities Regulatory Agency. And without sort of speaking out of school, PURA, by and large, most of the time will move along whatever rate increase that they come forward with. Sometimes they deny them, sometimes they adjust them, but most of the time they pass that along. And what precipitated all of this was not actually Isaias. It was the fact that in July, constituents and customers got this ridiculously large bill, and they didn't understand why, because their usage really didn't go up. And Eversource tried to blame that on a 2017 vote of the legislature that had to do with Millstone, which is our nuclear power plant. We could talk about that if you want to. But the reason for us to now look at what we did was both the July increase and the storm. And that is, from now on, Steve, they will determine rates and the rate increases that they ask for based on their performance, not just based on them saying, hey, we need a rate increase. They will be able to go through a set of metrics that will now be available to PURA to be able to determine that rate increase. That's the biggest thing, number one. The second biggest thing is that after Isaias, I publicly called on the company, as did a lot of other people, to give some form of credit to the customers that were out of power. Other states like New York, like Con Edison in New York, they gave these credits. We didn't in Eversource. And so the bill says that after 96 hours of no service, which is 4 days, there is a $25 per day credit to your bill. And if after 96 hours you have lost food or medicine, you can get up to $250 for that food and medicine if you can demonstrate that you did lose it. And I heard a lot of people who lost their groceries in back-to-back months, which was very difficult. So those are the two main pieces of the bill. There's a lot of other wonky stuff too, but those are the two biggest things that will probably be important to your customers and your listeners.
Okay, so there's a few questions I have, first of all, and I've talked about this multiple times on this with you, yes, with you, and without you. One of the issues that I was kind of big on was accountability for Pura itself. And, we had, in Brantford, we live on the border of East Haven. We have two very different utility companies, and they filed different reports prior to those storms that had them rated as different storms. What is the responsibility of Pura when it comes to preparing for these storms? They didn't seem to say anything to anybody after the last one. I don't know if somebody saw those filings or not, but what responsibility do they have? Is there anything in this bill that holds them accountable, increases, and anything in some way, shape, or form helps them better handle their job?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, it gives them a lot more power to investigate when they see something wrong. So in this specific example with Isaias, they had definitely nowhere near the amount of crews that they were supposed to have for the level of storm that they were reporting that they were anticipating. And then worse was that they didn't anticipate the level of storm that there was supposed to be, and they filed that they were only anticipating for a certain level. And I think, as you just alluded to, UI filed for the next bigger storm. Mm-hmm. Somebody needed to catch that, and nobody did. And this bill will put more pressure on Pura to review those filings and actually go back and say, hey, we crunched the math a little bit, and this doesn't really seem like this is a proper preparation. That will happen under this bill.
Okay. And not for nothing, when we start telling companies they have to pay out $25 a day up to $250 a day, how does that long term not just increase the cost of energy?
Because they can't go to ratepayers to pay that out. That's specifically in the bill, meaning that they have to go to their shareholders. They can't go to their customers for that. That would have cost in this storm, Steve, $19 million. Well, to you and I, that's a ton of money. To a company that made $1 billion in profit last year and whose CEO personally makes $20 million a year, the top 5 guys make $20 million a year, having them pay $19 million for a once in a 25-year storm where they didn't put power back on for the most of the people that are listening to this show in Brantford for about 7 days, I think is the least that they can do for customers who are paying, on average, a couple $100 a month for very, very high electricity costs. And that's why, again, I think that, I'm not necessarily one of these guys who is, always going after corporations and trying to make that my life's work. But I think in this instance, I had a meeting with Jamie Cosgrove, the governor, Senator Blumenthal, at town hall with some of the big executives from Eversource. And I will tell you, Steve, that they were very, very arrogant about their feeling that they should do more for the people of Brantford. And I'm hearing people call my phone crying, saying, Sean, I lost all my groceries 6 weeks ago during ECES, and now I lost them again because of this storm. I don't know how I'm going to afford the groceries because I lost my job at Stop and Shop, and I don't know what to do. These guys aren't getting those phone calls. They're making millions of dollars, and they live in Boston. And so I was very frustrated by that meeting. I know Jamie was too, and it really forced me to sort of have the resolve that doing this kind of thing is actually a good thing, and it can't be used against the customers with increases and things like that.
So in the first storm, and I won't pronounce it because you're better at pronouncing it than I am, but that first storm, the feedback we got from town officials all over the shoreline was that Eversource wasn't listening to town. Well, they weren't taking direction on where to go first. So we had senior living facilities not being addressed. It looked like in the second one that was better, but Brantford was kind of hit the hardest, and we weren't looking at the whole state. Is there something in place that kind of mandates the process by which they work with local officials going?
No, they're not. And I think that was one of the things that was missing from the bill. I talked to Chief Mahoney about this. In previous storms, Eversource would call the emergency operations center and say, hey, what's the priority, right? And
Yes, exactly.
no offense to my constituents in Pine Orchard, but when there's large scale buildings that house disabled people or seniors or people with different challenges, that should be the priority to put on versus somebody who's probably got a generator and probably got the means to be able to weather the storm versus somebody who's in a little more of a vulnerable position. And so that was not happening during either of the storms. And I know that was of great frustration to the town and our first responders because they were basically saying, look, guys, you've got to talk to us. You don't know anything about Brantford. You're mostly crews coming in from Canada or Massachusetts. You should talk to people on the ground who know what to do. And I think that's something that we're going to have to tackle during the regular session. And I'm considering introducing a bill about that, but it did not make that special session bill.
Okay. But it may come up next session.
Sure. I hope so. Should.
So before we move on from the special session, was there any other bills that were significant with regards to the shoreline?
The only other one that I would talk about has to do with elections, and it has to do with the fact that we were anticipating at the time that there was going to be a lot more people voting by absentee ballot. That's actually not really happening. We can talk about that because it's kind of an interesting thing to consider. In the primary, we had 60% of people who voted by absentee ballot. Right now, in Brantford, I don't know what the latest number is, but last week, about 4,300 of the, I think it's probably about 16 or 17,000 registered voters in Brantford had voted or had applied for one of those applications, which is a lot less than I would have thought. I think that's primarily because people are really afraid about their vote not counting, and they really want to make it count because this is a very, very important election. So I think they're getting more comfortable. They're going back to school, they're going back to work, and perhaps they feel more comfortable voting in person than they did in August. But regardless, what the bill does that we passed during the special session is it gives the town clerk, if they want it, the ability to go and look take the outer envelope, open it, and then that inner envelope that's signed, and basically put that in a separate file. If it's not signed, they discard it. So basically what that says is 4 days before the election, that Friday before the election, they can start lining up all the ballots to easily count them on election day, which is the law right now, that they can start counting them on election day. This just allows them and their volunteers to do a little bit of pre-work, which the registrars, especially in the bigger cities, said they needed to be able to get us the results that we all want, right? None of us want to not find out who won election for weeks or days. And lining everything up and discarding the bad ballots will make it a lot easier to count the votes on election day and on election night.
Okay, so first of all, in fairness, the primary was just your political parties.
Sure.
So your percentage is going to be higher than the general population. That would kind of make sense. Ray Ingraham just said 8,800 have went out in Brantford, which is probably about 42, 43%. So your numbers may be right. Okay, and that makes sense. I mean, the presidential thing in Connecticut may not make much of a difference, but state rep seats may come down to absentee, so that makes sense. Okay, good. Let's go to the big issue of the last few months. If we get away from Trump and from the EverSource issue, was this police. Now we'll talk about the bill first of all, but secondly, we all thought the police bill would be part of the second session, the special session that just passed. Primarily because it seems like Republicans and Democrats both kind of agreed that there were major changes needed to this thing. I mean, every Democrat I talked to said how to change it. Now, that brings up questions on how it passed, but start there. You voted for this bill. What did you see in it that made you decide to vote for it? And then what would you change going forward?
I guess I would preface this by saying that I'm the only man in my family that's not a cop. So my dad was a New York City police officer who actually was shot in the line of duty in 1980. My brother and brother-in-law are cops. My father-in-law was an FBI agent. So I'm the only guy in my family that's not a police officer. And I had extensive conversations with them and the guys that they work with, men and women that they work with, I should say, about this bill. And I also talked a lot to our local police departments. And I think I can safely say that they had concerns. I think that they had a lot of concerns about the first draft of this bill, which was even more concerning to them than what ended up passing. And I and others, because of that background I have and the support that I have for law enforcement, and the fact that I've been around cops my whole life, and I know firsthand that when nothing bothers me more than when I hear people say that all police officers are bad or all police officers are racist and things that are very offensive, given that the overwhelming vast majority of law enforcement are amazing people who are doing an amazing job in our cities and towns, that the rhetoric was taking over here a little bit. And the problem with politics, as you know, I'm not telling anybody anything that they don't know, is that the best legislation is not always made in the response to a crisis. And it's not always made in the response to specific situations, right? I think to Connecticut's credit, unlike a lot of states and cities, we did not pass this bill a week after the George Floyd situation. It was months and months and months after that situation. But I think, could there have been more time put into this? Absolutely. Could there be more time put into every bill we do? Absolutely. To get into why I voted for it, I think is because 95% of this bill are things that our local police departments are already doing anyway, and support. There are a few things like qualified immunity, like the use of force, that they still do have concerns with. But what I would say, Steve, is that the initial version of the bill, and specifically sections about those two sections, were a lot different than the one that ultimately passed. And I worked very hard to make sure that qualified immunity was not taken away from police officers, and it still has not been taken away from them, because I know firsthand how important that is for them to do. And so I think you're right. There are vast majority of people on both sides of the aisle do want to see changes, and I'm confident there will be changes. Why there weren't in this special session is because I think that we have a big problem in our politics today, Steve, which is that both parties are controlled by people who perhaps are at the fringes of both those parties, and those people have the loudest voices in politics. I think the vast majority of Democrats and Republicans that serve in the legislature are more towards the middle. But it's hard for us to get things done in a heightened, crazy, partisan, divisive atmosphere like the one we have right now, 30 days before an election, to have the rational people prevail in an argument or a debate about what to structure that bill like. And so I think everyone sort of agreed that this was not the atmosphere to have that debate. The biggest sections of the bill that people have issues with, like qualified immunity or use of force, don't go into effect until April and July of next year, respectively. And we have some time in January, after the silly season of elections ends, to actually sit down in a room, work with people on both sides of the aisle and with law enforcement, and make sure that we get this thing right. And I've given my word, literally, sitting in both the Guilford and Branford Police Department, to police officers, that I will be doing everything I can to address their concerns when we come back in January.
Okay, well, I think a lot of that makes sense. I also have to point out, though, that it's not just about it being a few months after the George Floyd murder, called a murder, but it seemed to be a rush to get it done before an election. And it may have been a few months after that, but we have large parts of this. It seems fairly out of the realm of ordinary to pass something knowing you're going to have to fix it and scheduling it 3 or 4 months down the road. I mean, we have a lot of uproar from police departments. You're running unopposed, but we saw an endorsement from North Branford and I believe Guilford's police unions that was damning on Christine Cohen, and supportive of her opponent. I would guess that they may have the same thing in your case if you were running with someone there. So what do you tell these police officers that are, some may be misinformation, some may be overreacting to certain things. I've had a podcast talking about, I don't believe qualified immunity was taken from this.
Yeah.
But you got a lot of police officers up in arms over this vote. Why could those sections not have been removed prior to the vote?
So I can't speak for every police officer. I can just tell you who I've talked to, right? And about my own family. And I would say that I think a lot of the opposition or the concerns about this bill is not so much about the bill itself. It's more about the fact that our men and women of law enforcement don't necessarily feel like we have their back anymore, and that they feel like there is a target on their back because of a few isolated incidents that have happened in other parts of the country, not dealing with them. And I think on the other side, there are a lot of people that I talk to who feel a genuine feeling that the police do not have their back. that they feel like they have been profiled, or that the system is not necessarily designed in a way that protects them. And so I am trying to see this from both perspectives, right? As the son and brother-in-law of police officers, somebody who loves cops, who's proud to be a supporter of the cops, and for a large part of my life thought that I was going to be a cop, and somebody who also is trying to hear some other voices that I represent, and that there are other voices that we need to pay attention to that I maybe in my life growing up in the way that I did maybe didn't pay attention to, and trying to craft legislation that tries to address both those things is not always the easiest thing to do. The guys that wrote this thing, I think, probably could have done more to be receptive to some of the concerns that they heard from people. And I'm sure there's things that they could have done more on the other side too. But they crafted a bill that they thought was representative of what needed to get done. And I think by and large, they did do that. But there were a couple of things that they didn't. And I think the biggest problem in politics today is that people are afraid to admit, hey, we could have done better, or I messed up and we got to do this again. And I'm never afraid to do that. And I think that no politician should be afraid to do that. And that'll be the case with this bill. And I am confident that in the long run, we will get this right.
So let's talk about that. Connecticut has a significant one-party rule right now. The closest vote was probably for governor, but House is overwhelmingly Democratic. The Senate is not overwhelmingly, but Democratic. 2 years ago when Lamont was running, there were things like polls on the ballot, basically, that we were talking about, things like sports betting. That's a personal one for me. Legalization of marijuana. Yet with all of these majorities, none of those things got passed. What is the agenda of the Democrats in Hartford right now? Like, what are they looking? We have a special session to pass a police bill, but the things that were talked about ad nauseum during an election season were clearly ignored. So I know your view on marijuana, so we won't have to go there specifically, but on these bills where there seems to be significant Democratic support in a state with a Democratic-controlled every branch of government, why are these things not passed?
Well, the easiest answer to that is probably that there's like 3 or 4 different Democratic parties, right? And in every other country in the world, there's 5 or 6 major political parties. In America, we have 2. Every one of your listeners that is a Republican does not necessarily support everything that Donald Trump says. And every Democrat doesn't necessarily support the things that AOC says. And yet we sort of see both those guys or people as the heads of our parties, right? Or the people that are driving our party. So for me, someone who supports sports betting because I love sports and I'm completely down to gamble on them, even though that's probably a bad idea for my bank account, I'm cool to push that forward. But there's a whole segment of my party that's probably not cool to push that forward, right? And so I think it's sort of hard to sort of say, hey, what's the stance of the Democratic Party? Because it depends on what kind of Democrat you talk to. For me, my biggest thing is that we have to make Connecticut more affordable for people. I don't think that we necessarily focus on that as much as we need to. And I think whether it's looking at housing, whether it's looking at jobs, whether it's looking at electricity, we have to make Connecticut affordable for Connecticut families. If you ask another Democrat what the most important thing is, they may say paid family leave and minimum wage, right? But it depends on what district you're talking about. And what I think is the best thing about the Democratic Party compared to my friends on the other side of the aisle is that we're a very big tent. It sometimes makes governing very frustrating and difficult, but there are a lot of different voices in our party, and together we address different things that are important to the state versus perhaps my friends on the other side of the aisle where 99% of their representatives are representing either rural or suburban towns in Connecticut, whereas Connecticut, the Democrats have rural, urban, suburban. It's a very different mix of people and therefore a different mix of priorities.
In your estimation, will tolls come back up?
I don't think that tolls will come up in the form that they were presented last year. I've always said, and I've been on the record since my very first campaign in 2014 that you covered, we should have border tolls or some version of them. And people always say, well, you can't just have border tolls because they can't just be at the border. Okay, fine. Well, don't put them just in Darien and New Canaan. Put one on the New Haven, Hartford 91 interchange, one in Stonington, one in Greenwich, and one in Windsor Locks, and we will get some revenue from the out-of-state people. And once in a while, when you drive to go to a Yankees game and you pay a toll in Greenwich, you'll pay it from Brantford. I think the 56 toll gantries on 95 is very excessive and is not going to happen anytime soon. But we do have a big problem, and we have to figure out a way to do it. There are only so many options left in the toolbox, and people don't want to do any of them, but we have to do something. And for me, that's the way we have to start.
All right, so we've heard a lot in the last few weeks, obviously with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, on the new justice being nominated. You've posted, and I think we've had a press conference as well where you talked about this. There are some things that the state has done already, for example, on pre-existing conditions and things of that nature. Give us your idea, what happens if she's put in, we know the history of some of her decisions. We know you've worked on healthcare quite a bit over the last year, 6 years now that you've been in. Talk about the impacts, the potential impacts of this nominee and what happens with healthcare going forward.
Your listeners are paying attention closer than I am probably, so I don't need to run through the litany of things that this would do. My whole premise and what I said at that press conference last week is that I think the voters should decide the fate of where we go as a country. And I think that it is the height of hypocrisy for the fact that, when my party had one of these vacancies 200 days before an election, the Republicans stood up and said, no way, it's too close to an election, let the voters decide. And now 40 days before an election, they're saying, no way, we have an obligation to do this. We got to rush this through. I think that the majority of people in this country are fed up with the day-to-day shenanigans of Washington on both sides of the aisle. And I think that they are viewing this as a pretty important question that's going to determine a lot about America going forward, whether that's on reproductive rights, healthcare, equality, criminal justice, the environment, you name it. I think all of those things would be impacted if this person would be appointed to the court. She is certainly qualified to be a justice on the Supreme Court. She's got a very good resume. I just disagree with a lot of the things that she stands for. I think most of America disagrees with most of the things that she stands for. And I think when told that a lot of the things that have been settled law in this country for years would potentially be overruled by somebody whose appointer and the people who confirm her may be removed from office in 29 days, I think that they would say, wait. And I'd be the first person to say, if Donald Trump wins this election and the Senate stays, the way it does, or even if it doesn't, even if the Democrats take the Senate and Trump wins, it's still his prerogative and right to introduce that person. And if it's her, then it's her. He won the election. But to say I won the election and it's my duty when he won the election almost 4 years ago, to me and most voters, I think, does not necessarily pass the smell test. And that's why I think people are saying, let's wait to see what happens in 30 days. And then if the voters speak, that would be an endorsement of this lady. If they speak against her, that's not.
But terms are 4 years. I mean, it's not, Donald Trump wasn't elected for 3 years and 10 months. I mean, he was elected for 4 years, and that would be, if the Democrat was in there, same thing would be true. And both political parties have the same degree of hypocrisy. There's not, sure. One has a monopoly on that. So if the roles were reversed, I would think the Democrats would do probably the same thing the Republicans have done. So,
that's why people hate politics.
Yeah, I mean, but it's true, though. I mean, Obama was in office before. Trump's in office. He gets 4 years. He gets to put a nominee forward. It's kind of hard to blame him. Yep. The Senate is hypocrisy, no question. No question it's hypocritical, but that's kind of what politicians do.
I know.
So, all right. So from an actual impact, though, if Obamacare was undone, just declared unconstitutional or not legal, how would that impact Connecticut and Connecticut residents?
Okay. Every single person in Connecticut has benefited from Obamacare, whether they know it or not. And the problem with Obamacare is, like everything else in our society, it's become over-politicized so that people are reflexively saying Obamacare bad simply because they're Republican and Trump says it's bad. Just like Democrats do that to things that Trump does, right? So I'm being equal opportunity here. The issue with the ACA going away is a couplefold. Number one, immediately in Connecticut, 200,000 people would lose their health insurance because we have the exchange and we have people that have been signed up for Medicaid because of it. Everyone who is under the age of 26 and still on their parents' insurance, perhaps because they can't get a job out of college because the economy is not necessarily great for that, would lose their ability to stay on their parents' health insurance. Pre-existing conditions, something that you hear about a lot, would immediately go away. And I know the first retort from the president is, I will protect those pre-existing conditions. He's been saying that for 5 years. I've never seen a plan for him to do that. Even when he was one vote away from repealing the ACA, when John McCain decided to come down the stairs and vote against that bill, there was no plan put in place to protect those people with pre-existing conditions. And there are 500,000 of them in Connecticut. Every single insurance plan, because of the ACA, has to cover what are called essential health benefits. That's prescription drug care, maternal care, hospitalization, primary care, wellness care. All those things would go away. And so when you say ACA should be repealed, most people think that that should be the case because they're still paying a lot of money for their health insurance. That's a different problem, and one that we have not done a good enough job of tackling. And I'd be the first to admit that, and I'm trying to do that. But we should not scrap all those things that I just mentioned, which are working and doing good for the people of Connecticut, simply based on partisan politics. And we certainly should not do that necessarily at the whim of an unelected judge, especially if people don't have a plan in place to immediately replace that when that goes away. And so, who knows what timeline the court will make that decision in, but they're going to hear this case on November 10th. And if she is appointed to the court, there will be a 6-3 majority against that bill. And I just think that it's a pretty good likelihood that it would get repealed, and that would cause a lot of damage to a lot of different people. My preferred solution, Steve, of course, like everything else that I do in my life, is for both parties to sit down, say, okay, here are the things that we agree with, talk about the things that we don't, and come up with a solution that works for the majority of people. And I think that that's what most people that are not the absolute partisan warriors of their respective parties would actually want to see get done.
Okay. Let's move on to COVID.
Yeah.
And the state's reaction. It looked like the state was in pretty good shape, but it looks like the numbers are going up a little bit. What are you seeing in the district, and what are you seeing be done from the state standpoint of COVID?
Well, look, I think the state's done a really good job. I think the governor has done a really good job. I think that he has been a very steady leader in this crisis. I think he's been making informed decisions based on science and people that are public health experts, and not necessarily based on the fact that all of us are anxious to get back to our normal life. I, as the dad of a 1-year-old who's been mostly working from home, is certainly first and foremost of wanting to get back to that normal life. But I think that we've been doing a really good job. I think the schools have done a very good job. Over here in Guilford, we've had one positive case in the first month since school has gone back. I'm not sure the latest stats in Brantford, but I think it's comparable that there has not been any big outbreak. And I think that we've done a really good job of putting together unique plans that work for our towns. And I think it's going to keep going. I think that obviously we're not out of the woods yet. I think that the fact that we're still hovering around a 2% infection rate in October is a good sign. I think it's a sign that it's working. But we are entering flu season. We're entering a time that people are going to have, I would say, cabin fever a little bit more, right? Because it's going to get cold again. So you won't necessarily be able to go and get, a lobster roll at Lenny's and have sort of a nice time outside with your friends and family. It's going to be harder for us to maintain that social distance, but it's going to be really, really important. And I'm pretty sure that if we can do this for a few more months and we do get some sort of treatment or a vaccine, that we will sort of be back to a semblance of normal by the, sort of spring, summer of next year. But we have to keep going with the progress that we're making, and, getting silly about not wearing masks or having big parties, and especially young people sort of acting like they're invincible here and they don't have to worry about this is definitely not the way to go.
All right. Well, I appreciate all your opinions on that. I do have one other question, and that is on development of the Dutton Ranch. Now, I don't know if those who are regular watchers, they know I'm a big Kevin Costner fan, and we watched Yellowstone. I found out from Sean earlier today he watches Yellowstone as well. So if we were going to give now you haven't finished season 1 yet, so I don't want to give anything away. We just had a big cliffhanger at the end of season 3. But in the episodes you've watched so far, if you were doing a commercial, why should somebody watch Yellowstone?
Okay, in 30 seconds, this is my pitch.
Okay.
Kevin Costner, one of the greatest actors of our time.
No question.
He stars as the richest man in Montana, owns the biggest ranch in Montana. It's the size of Rhode Island. And he and his children are basically trying to navigate the tricky world of business, politics, bureaucracy, perceived threats. And by the way, they're all doing it in like the most beautiful place in America, besides Connecticut, which is the great west of Montana. A lot of melodrama. My wife and I are watching it, so there's something in there for the ladies. There's also a lot of action. There's also a lot of fighting. So if you're a guy that's kind of into that kind of thing, check it out. And I highly recommend it. It's very bingeable, watchable show.
All right, so if we try to have you on before election season again, before November 3rd, you'll have at least the first season completed.
I feel confident that I can complete the first season by the end of election day. I got 3 weeks to do that. I can probably squeeze that in. But what I'm going to say to you is, before you all started watching this, I was trying to convince Steve that he needs to watch The Wire, and I think he agreed to check that out. So
I did.
When I come back on, you will have had to agree to watch the first season of The Wire. Then we'll do a little show swap, recap, and go from there.
How many episodes is that first season?
I think there's 10 in the first season.
All right, I think it's the same for Yellowstone. So, all right, I can, I'll do that. It's not a problem.
Good.
Okay. All right. So we'll aim for probably the week before election day. I don't want to do that with other people because I want to give everybody a chance to their opponents, but because you're unopposed, we'll do that. I'll have 10 episodes of The Wire for season 1. You'll finish Yellowstone, and we'll go there at that time. Okay. Sean, I appreciate it.
Great to be
here. The rest of that first season. Thanks for coming on. If people have questions, I'll forward it. One person did say, my issue with Obamacare is that it's demanded you take it or you are fined. I could be wrong, but didn't that aspect of it get removed?
It did get removed in the 2017 Republican tax bill, but Christine, let me just tell you why that's so important. I know that sounds contrary to logic, and people don't like to be forced into doing things, but why that's so important is because the only way that insurance works is if everyone participates, regardless of their health challenges. If the insurance pool is only the sickest people, which would be the people who are most likely to buy insurance because they need it the most, it's going to be more and more and more expensive for those people. Whereas if you require everyone to buy insurance, the people like myself that don't go to the doctor or a lot, or the people that are relatively healthy, they help keep insurance affordable for everybody. And that's why that individual mandate is so important. And ironically, the architect of that is not Barack Obama. It's actually Mitt Romney and the Heritage Foundation. So a Republican think tank is the one who actually came up with that idea, not Obama. And the reason for that is because it's the same principle that we use for all insurance, is that unless you have everybody buying it, it's very expensive. And I'll give you another example of that right now, Steve. It's something I hear a lot about, which is long-term care insurance. This is something that only a few people bought, and it's getting more and more expensive for people to have it because the only people buying it are people that are sick. And it becomes so expensive that you can't keep it. To insurance markets, to make them work, you need everybody in it, and that's what drives the price down.
Yeah, when Obamacare was first passed, one of the concerns was that people are signing up for insurance on the way to the hospital.
Yep.
You break a leg, and then as you're getting in the ambulance, you're calling for insurance. It has to be spread. And actually, COVID's a good example of why that's needed, primarily because you have people who are refusing to go to the hospital and get checked for things because they don't have insurance.
Yep.
And in many cases, going to the doctor on a regular basis will preemptively handle far more expensive things down the road. And so that aspect is a pretty significant aspect of it. I know it's a pain if you haven't used it, you have to pay for it.
And to your point, Steve, when you go to the hospital or the doctor without insurance, that's called uncompensated care, which means that doctor's office or that hospital has to eat that charge because they legally have to care for you. And if you don't have the ability to pay for that, guess who does? The taxpayers, because they have to reimburse that doctor or that hospital for that care. So by incentivizing everyone to have insurance, you're actually saving yourself money as a taxpayer because otherwise you're paying for it anyway, even if you know it or not.
Yeah, and it's something we're all going to use. The idea that some people aren't going to use healthcare, when you get a serious injury, you're going to the hospital.
Yep.
So it's not really something that we get to choose out of, or we'll likely choose out of in this case. Okay. Sean, I appreciate it. We'll probably talk to you in a few weeks. Enjoy the rest of Yellowstone.
Good to be on, Steve. Talk to
Have
you
a
soon.
good one. I'll talk to you. Okay, so I thank Sean for coming on, and it was good to have him. We're going to try to have more guests on a regular basis. We're going to try to get as many elected officials as we can. We'll set that up for later this week and next week. Tomorrow, I'll be back. I have no idea what those topics will be, but very likely we'll talk a lot more about Trump and him back at the White House and some of the decisions that were made. Kathy just posted the exchange is way too expensive. I had to get Christian healthcare. I actually heard Christian healthcare was relatively low in price, so I don't know how that works. Yeah, a lot of times on those healthcare exchanges, the healthcare isn't that much less expensive unless you qualify for a significant government subsidy. But for those people who need it, it is helpful for some. But it's certainly not cheap. It's not free by any means. Healthcare has an incredible cost. And as Sean said, one thing that's true is getting people covered. The cost of healthcare are really two different conversations that we have to have. And the Obamacare fell short, in my opinion, of addressing the actual cost of healthcare. It provided some things out there for people to get it, and in pre-existing conditions, and there's many other good things about it, but it didn't do nearly enough to talk about the cost of healthcare. And so that's another conversation we have to have. We may have that again before we get to Election Day. But thank you again, Sean, for coming. Guys, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the questions and comments. If there are more questions for Sean, send them to me. I'll make sure to get over to him. And we will be back tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.